The alarm screamed through the North Sea platform's communication system at 3:47 a.m., jolting me from the half-sleep that comes with working the graveyard shift 200 feet beneath the churning surface. I'd been down here for 18 hours already, my diving suit's recycled air tasting like metal and fear, when Rodriguez's voice crackled through my helmet comm. "Marcus, we've got a catastrophic failure in Section C7. The whole lower support structure is compromised. I need you down there now." I pressed my face against the porthole of the dive bell, watching the skeletal remains of the Poseidon 7 oil rig stretch into the abyssal darkness below. The platform had been abandoned for 3 years after what the company called a structural incident, but everyone who worked these waters knew the truth. 17 men had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their empty diving suits, floating in the North Sea like discarded cocoons. "Copy that, Rodriguez. Descending now." The dive bell's mechanical whir filled my ears as I prepared my gear. My welding torch felt heavier than usual in my hands, the familiar weight somehow ominous in the pre-dawn darkness. I'd been working underwater construction for 12 years, ever since the Navy discharged me, but I'd never felt the ocean's malevolence quite like this. As the bell descended past the main platform into the abandoned lower levels, my helmet lights carved weak tunnels through the black water. Schools of deep-sea fish scattered like silver ghosts, their bioluminescent scales leaving trails of ethereal light in their wake. The pressure gauge on my suit read 200 feet and climbing, or rather, sinking. That's when I heard it for the first time. A sound like nothing I'd encountered in a decade of deep-sea work. A low, resonant thrumming that seemed to emanate from the rig's bowels themselves. It wasn't mechanical. I knew every sound these platforms made, from the groan of stressed metal to the whistle of escaping gas. This was something organic, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Rodriguez, are you picking up any acoustic anomalies down here?" Static answered me. Then, faintly, "Marcus, losing your signal, interference from hull." The communication cut to white noise, leaving me alone with that terrible thrumming sound. I maneuvered the dive bell towards Section C7, my lights illuminating twisted girders and ruptured piping that looked less like structural damage and more like something had torn through the metal with immense force. "Bite marks," my mind whispered, though I pushed the thought away. The ocean played tricks on even experienced divers. The pressure, the isolation, the endless dark. They could make you see monsters where there were only shadows. But as I secured my diving line and prepared to enter the flooded section, I noticed something that made my blood run cold despite the suit's heating system. The metal wasn't just torn, it was scored with deep gouges that followed no pattern of mechanical failure I'd ever seen. They were organic, curved, like claw marks from something impossibly large. I checked my oxygen supply. 6 hours and 37 minutes. Plenty of time for a routine repair job. I had no way of knowing I was about to discover that some repairs come with a cost measured not in time, but in survival. The airlock cycled and I stepped into the flooded corridor of Section C7. My feet touched the deck with a muffled clang that echoed strangely in the water-filled space. The sound seemed to travel farther than it should have, bouncing off unseen surfaces in the maze-like interior of the abandoned platform. That's when the thrumming stopped. In the sudden silence, I realized I wasn't alone. The flooded corridor stretched before me like the throat of some prehistoric beast, my helmet lights barely penetrating 30 feet into the murky water. Debris floated past, pieces of equipment, personal effects from the crew that had vanished 3 years ago, and things I couldn't quite identify that looked disturbingly organic. I consulted the platform schematics displayed on my helmet's hood. Section C7 was supposed to be a simple maintenance corridor leading to the primary support struts. but the map showed a bewildering network of passages that branched and interconnected like a spider's web. Either the blueprints were wrong, or something had been building down here. My boots stirred up sediment from the deck as I moved deeper into the section, each step releasing clouds of particulate matter that danced in my lights like snow. The water here was different from the open ocean, thicker somehow, with an oily consistency that left residue on my visor. It smelled wrong, too, even through my suit's filtration system. Where seawater should carry the clean, salt-sharp scent of the deep, this had an underlying sweetness, like decay masked by perfume. 20 minutes into my exploration, I found the first body. It floated in what had once been equipment storage room, tethered to a support beam by its own diving line. The nameplate read Kowalski, P. I remembered him from the crew manifest, a good welder, family man from Aberdeen. His diving suit was intact, no signs of decompression or equipment failure, but something had gotten inside with him. The suit was filled with what looked like thick, translucent mucus, and Kowalski's face behind the helmet visor was changed. His features were still recognizable, but his skin had taken on a waxy, almost larval appearance. Most disturbing were his eyes. They'd turned milky white, but I could swear they tracked my movement as I swam past. I forced myself to focus on the job. 17 men had died down here, and dwelling on their fate wouldn't help me complete the repair and get back to the surface. But as I continued through the labyrinthine passages, I began to notice patterns that chilled me more than the North Sea's frigid embrace. The corridors had been modified. Where the original platform design called for straight passages and right-angled turns, someone or something had carved curved tunnels that spiraled deeper into the structure. The metal walls were covered in the same organic scoring I'd seen outside, but here the marks were more purposeful, more deliberate. They formed channels and grooves that directed water flow in specific patterns, creating currents that seemed designed to funnel things toward the platform's deeper levels. My oxygen gauge read 5 hours and 12 minutes when I found the feeding chamber. It had once been the platform's main machinery room, but now it resembled nothing so much as a spider's pantry. Dozens of sea creatures hung suspended from the ceiling by gossamer strands, fish, crabs, even a small shark, all in various stages of being drained. Their bodies were translucent, like empty skins, and in the center of the room stood a structure that defied easy description. It rose from the deck like a twisted coral formation, all curves and spiraling chambers, but it pulsed with an organic rhythm that spoke of something living. The surface was covered in thousands of tiny openings, each one rimmed with what looked like teeth. As I watched, in horrified fascination, one of the suspended fish twitched, and I realized they weren't dead. They were being kept alive, slowly consumed from within. The thrumming sound returned, stronger now, and I felt it in my bones as much as heard it. It was coming from the organic structure, and as the vibrations increased, the feeding tendrils began to pulse more rapidly. Whatever lived down here was waking up. I backed away from the chamber, trying to orient myself using the modified corridor system, but the maze-like passages seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Passages I'd marked on my mental map were gone, replaced by new tunnels that curved downward into darkness. The platform structure was changing around me, adapting, and I began to understand the horrifying truth. The structural failure hadn't damaged the platform, it had improved it. Something had been reshaping the Poseidon 7 from within, turning it into a hunting ground perfectly designed for its needs. And now, with my movements and the vibrations from my equipment, I'd announced my presence to whatever intelligence lurked in the depths. The thrumming became more complex, almost like language, and I felt the water around me begin to move in subtle currents. I was being herded, guided deeper into the structure by an entity that had been waiting 3 years for fresh prey. My helmet lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I saw something massive move past the chamber's entrance. Something that had learned to use the shadows between my lights as camouflage. I checked my oxygen, 4 hours and 53 minutes. The hunt had begun. I forced my breathing to steady as I backed away from the feeding chamber, every survival instinct screaming at me to flee toward the surface. But the maze of corridors had become a trap, and I could feel the presence moving through the water around me, staying just beyond the reach of my failing lights. The thrumming had evolved into something more complex, a series of rapid pulses followed by longer, resonant notes that seemed to map the structure around me. Sooner, I realized with growing dread, whatever hunted me was blind, navigating by sound and vibration in the absolute darkness of the deep platform. I pressed myself against a corridor wall, trying to minimize my movement, but even my breathing created bubbles that rose and popped against the ceiling with tiny, betraying sounds. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain the creature could hear it, and every small adjustment of my position sent vibrations through the water that felt like screams in the silence. That's when I discovered something that offered a slim hope of survival. The walls of the modified corridors were lined with the same organic material I'd seen in the feeding chamber, but here it was softer, almost spongy. When I pressed against it gently, it absorbed the vibrations from my movements, muffling the sounds that would otherwise give away my position. I began to move more deliberately, using the organic lining to mask my progress as I tried to navigate back toward the main platform structure. But the maze seemed to shift around me, passages closing off as new ones opened, always leading me deeper into the creature's domain. My helmet lights failed completely 20 minutes later, plunging me into darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive. I activated the emergency backup illumination, but it cast only a weak red glow that made the organic corridors look like the interior of a vast circulatory system. The comparison wasn't entirely wrong. I could feel a pulse in the walls now, synchronized with the thrumming sound, as if the entire platform had become part of some enormous organism. I was feeling my way along a particularly narrow passage when my gloved hand encountered something that made me recoil in horror. It was warm, soft, and definitely alive. As my fingers traced its surface, I realized I was touching what remained of another diver, but this one had been integrated into the wall structure. The organic material had grown around him, incorporating his body into the platform's living architecture while keeping him alive, conscious, feeding off his life force in some unimaginable symbiosis. His helmet visor turned toward me in the dim red light, and behind the glass I saw eyes that held a terrible awareness. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear through the water in his sealed suit, but the desperation in his expression was unmistakable. He was begging me to kill him. I fumbled for my welding torch, but before I could activate it, the thrumming sound exploded around me with deafening intensity. The creature had found us, and it was not pleased that I'd discovered one of its preserved specimens. The water erupted with movement as something massive surged through the passage behind me. I caught a glimpse of translucent flesh, covered in bioluminescent patterns, tentacles thick as tree trunks, and rows of teeth that extended down what might have been a throat, but could have been its entire body. The creature was less a single entity than a collection of organic systems that had learned to work together. A living network that had colonized the abandoned platform and turned it into an extension of itself. I triggered my welding torch without thinking, the brilliant flame cutting through the water in a stream of superheated plasma. The creature recoiled from the light and heat, its thrumming becoming a shriek of pain and rage that vibrated through every metal surface of the platform. For a moment, I thought I might have wounded it seriously. But then I realized my mistake. The flame had illuminated the entire passage, revealing not one creature but dozens of them. What I'd taken for a single massive entity was actually a colony, a hive mind of deep-sea horrors that had made the platform their home. They ranged in size from small jellyfish-like scouts to enormous predatory forms that filled entire corridors, but they all shared the same translucent flesh and the same terrible intelligence burning in their clustered eyes. My oxygen gauge read 3 hours and 41 minutes as I turned and ran, or rather swam as fast as my equipment would allow, through the maze of organic passages. Behind me, the colony surged forward in pursuit, their combined thrumming creating a sound like the ocean itself screaming. But as I fled deeper into the platform's bowels, I began to understand the true horror of my situation. This wasn't a chase, it was a carefully orchestrated herding. The creatures were driving me towards something, guiding my panicked flight along specific routes while cutting off escape paths. They'd been doing this for 3 years, perfecting their technique on the 17 men who'd vanished, learning how humans moved and thought and feared. I was swimming directly into their trap, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The herding became more obvious as my panicked flight continued through the platform's transformed interior. Every time I tried to turn toward what my compass indicated was the direction of the main structure, I found passages blocked by the organic growths or filled with waiting creatures whose bioluminescent patterns pulsed in anticipation. The colony was patient, coordinated, and utterly ruthless in its manipulation of my escape routes. My breathing had become ragged with exertion and fear, consuming oxygen faster than my suit's recycling system could compensate. 2 hours and 57 minutes remaining. At this rate of consumption, I had maybe 90 minutes before the CO2 scrubbers failed and I began to suffocate in my own exhalations. The passage I was following opened into a vast chamber that had once been the platform's central processing facility. Here, the colony's modifications were most apparent and most horrifying. The entire space had been converted into a nursery. Thousands of translucent sacs hung from the ceiling and walls, each one containing what looked like developing organisms in various stages of growth. Some held creatures no larger than my fist, their primitive features barely visible through the organic membrane. Others contained horrors the size of grown men, their eyes already open and tracking my movement as I entered their domain. But it was the sacs containing human forms that made me understand the full scope of the colony's intelligence. The missing crew members were here, all 17 of them, suspended in a state between life and death while the creatures studied them, learned from them, prepared to become them. Their bodies were being slowly replaced with organic material, but their brains remained intact, conscious, processing the experience of their gradual transformation. I recognized Rodriguez among them, his face peaceful behind the membrane, but his eyes filled with an awareness that chilled me more than the North Sea's embrace. He'd been the one sending me down here, but not by choice. The creatures had been using him as a puppet, his voice transmitted through some organic equivalent of the platform's communication system to lure me into their trap. The thrumming intensified as I moved through the nursery, and I realized the sound wasn't just communication, it was digestion. The entire colony was processing information, breaking down everything they'd learned from their human specimens and incorporating it into their collective consciousness. They were becoming more human with each passing day, but retaining all the predatory instincts of their deep-sea origins. At the center of the nursery stood the source of the colony's intelligence, a massive brain-like structure that pulsed with bioelectric activity. Tendrils connected it to every sac, every organic modification to the platform, creating a neural network that spanned the entire structure. As I watched in fascination and horror, I saw human memories playing across its surface like movies, scenes from the lives of the crew members, their knowledge and experiences being cataloged and absorbed. The creature mind noticed my attention and responded by projecting its own memories directly into my consciousness. I saw the platform 3 years ago, functioning normally until a deep-sea survey drill punched through into an underwater cavern system that had been sealed for millions of years. The colony had been waiting there in the dark, dreaming of the surface world, and the platform's breach had given them their first taste of human civilization. They'd risen from the depths like a living nightmare, overwhelming the crew not through violence but through patience and cunning. One by one, the men had been taken, studied, their knowledge harvested to help the colony understand this new environment they'd discovered. The platform had been transformed from the inside out, turned into a perfect hunting ground and research facility. But the memories also revealed something else. The colony's ultimate goal. They weren't content to remain on the abandoned platform. They were preparing for expansion, using what they'd learned from human minds to plan an assault on the surface world. The Poseidon 7th was just the beginning, a prototype for larger operations that would convert entire cities into nurseries for their kind. I had to stop them. But first, I had to survive. The thrumming reached a crescendo as the colony's scouts began to emerge from the passages leading into the nursery. They'd finished herding me to where they wanted me, and now came the final phase of their hunt. My welding torch felt pathetically inadequate against the mass of creatures flowing toward me, but it was the only weapon I had. I activated the flame and began to burn through the tendrils connecting the nearest sacs to the central brain. The colony's shriek of pain and rage vibrated through every surface, and the creatures rushing toward me faltered as their coordination was disrupted. But for every connection I severed, two more seemed to take its place, and I could see the colony adapting its network to compensate for the damage. My oxygen gauge read 1 hour and 33 minutes when I made the discovery that would either save my life or end it in the most spectacular way possible. The welding torch hadn't just damaged the colony's neural network. It had revealed something hidden beneath the organic growth at the base of the central brain. Emergency hull breach charges, designed to blow open escape routes in case of catastrophic platform failure. The colony had grown over them, but hadn't understood their purpose, leaving them intact and armed. If I could trigger them, the resulting explosion would blow a hole in the platform's hull large enough to create massive decompression. The sudden pressure change would either blast me to the surface or crush me instantly, but it would also destroy the nursery and cripple the colony's expansion plans. The creatures were almost upon me now, their bioluminescent patterns flashing in complex communications as they coordinated their final assault. I had seconds to make the choice that would determine not just my survival, but possibly the fate of everyone on the surface. I pressed the torch against the emergency charges and smiled grimly behind my helmet visor. Sometimes the only way out is through. The emergency charges detonated with a roar that turned the water around me into a living thing of violence and chaos. The platform's hull split like an eggshell, releasing 3 years of accumulated pressure in a single catastrophic moment that sent shockwaves through every modified corridor and organic chamber of the colony's domain. I was caught in the explosion's edge, my diving suit's reinforced plating the only thing standing between me and instant death as debris tore through the water around me. The welding torch was ripped from my grasp, its flame extinguished in the sudden violence, leaving me tumbling through the darkness as the platform's structure collapsed around me. The colony's shriek of pain and rage filled the water with harmonics that I felt in my bones, their collective voice becoming a wordless scream of loss as the nursery was torn apart. Thousands of developing organisms were swept away in the rushing water, their growth sacs ruptured by the pressure wave. 3 years of patient cultivation destroyed in seconds. But the colony wasn't helpless. Even as their physical structure collapsed, I could feel their intelligence adapting. The surviving members of their network communicating in rapid pulses as they tried to contain the damage. Some were already moving to seal the hull breach, their bodies flowing like living putty to plug the gaps and restore the platform's integrity. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they succeeded. 30 seconds to reach the breach before the colony trapped me in their wounded but still functional hunting ground. My suit's propulsion system was damaged but functional, and I used every remaining ounce of power to drive myself toward the jagged opening in the platform's side. The water rushing through the breach was like swimming upstream in a hurricane, but I fought against the current with desperate determination. Behind me, I could sense the colony's scouts recovering from the explosion, their movements becoming more coordinated as the Central Intelligence reasserted control over the network. My oxygen gauge read 57 minutes when I finally reached the hull breach, my suit's systems flashing warnings about structural damage and failing life support. The opening was partially blocked by debris and rapidly growing organic material as the colony worked to seal it, but there was still a gap large enough for me to squeeze through. As I pulled myself toward freedom, something wrapped around my ankle. One of the colony's scouts had followed me to the breach, its grip iron strong as it tried to drag me back into the platform's depths. I could see its face in the dim light filtering through the opening, a nightmare fusion of human features and deep-sea horror, with Rodriguez's eyes staring at me from a mass of translucent flesh and writhing tentacles. "Stay," it said, and the voice was Rodriguez's, but distorted by the organic modifications to his throat. "Stay and join us. The surface world is ending anyway. We are the future." I kicked frantically, trying to break free, but the creature's grip only tightened. More scouts were approaching, their bioluminescent patterns pulsing in the excited rhythm of a successful hunt. I could feel the hull breach sealing around us as the colony's repair efforts continued, the gap growing smaller with each passing second. That's when I remembered the emergency beacon. Every deep-sea diving suit was equipped with a high-powered transmitter designed to guide rescue teams to downed divers. I'd never needed to use mine before, but the theory was simple: a concentrated burst of electromagnetic energy, powerful enough to punch through water and reach the surface monitoring stations. What I hadn't known until that moment was how the colony would react to such a signal. It triggered the beacon, and the electromagnetic pulse that erupted from my suit was like setting off a flashbang in the middle of a library. The colony's entire network, dependent on bioelectric communication, was temporarily scrambled by the interference. The scout holding my ankle released me with a convulsive shudder, its features dissolving back into primitive flesh as its connection to the Central Intelligence was severed. I didn't waste the opportunity. With my last reserves of suit power, I launched myself through the rapidly closing breach and into the open ocean beyond. The pressure differential caught me like a giant's hand, accelerating my ascent toward the surface at a rate that would have killed me, if not for my suit's emergency decompression systems. But as I rose through the black water, I could see lights beginning to flicker deep below. The colony recovering from the electromagnetic shock, their network slowly re-establishing itself. They would survive the damage I'd done, adapt to it, learn from it, and someday, they would try again to reach the surface world. My oxygen gauge read 12 minutes when I finally broke through into the gray dawn light of the North Sea. The Deepwater Titan, the support vessel that had deployed me to the platform, was a black speck on the horizon, too far away to reach with my remaining air supply. But they'd received my beacon signal. I could see the rescue boat already cutting through the waves toward me, its searchlights sweeping the water as they followed the transmitter's coordinates to my location. I floated on the surface, exhausted and traumatized but alive, watching the sun rise over water that looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Somewhere far below, the colony was licking its wounds and planning its next move. The surface world had no idea what was waiting for them in the depths. As the rescue boat approached, I began to plan my own next move. Someone had to warn them. Someone had to make them understand the threat that lurked beneath the waves. Someone had to make sure that the colony's expansion stopped here, with the Poseidon 7 platform. But first, I had to survive the ascent. And in the back of my mind, a terrible thought was growing. What if some of the colony had already reached the surface? What if the 17 missing crew members hadn't been the first humans they'd encountered? What if they'd been practicing? The rescue boat reached me just as my oxygen supply hit the 3-minute mark, my suit's alarms screaming warnings about imminent system failure. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Henley pulled me aboard with the efficiency of someone who'd performed the same rescue dozens of times, but I could see the questions in her eyes as she helped me out of my damaged diving gear. "Marcus, what the hell happened down there? Your beacon signal was off the charts. Looked like you'd triggered every emergency system at once." I wanted to tell her everything about the colony, the nursery, the threat that still lurked in the platform's depths, but the words seemed inadequate to describe what I'd experienced. How do you explain to someone that humanity's next evolutionary step might be waiting in the deep ocean, patient and hungry, and far more intelligent than we'd ever imagined? "Equipment failure," I said finally, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. "Major structural collapse in the lower levels. The whole platform is compromised." Henley frowned as she ran a diagnostic on my suit's systems. "This damaged pattern is bizarre, Marcus. Looks like something tried to tear your gear apart from the outside. And these organic residues..." She held up a sample vial filled with the translucent mucus that had coated the platform's corridors. "I've never seen anything like this." The return trip to Aberdeen took 4 hours, during which I sat in the boat's medical bay and tried to process what I'd experienced. The colony's projected memories haunted me. Images of other platforms, other crews, other accidents that might not have been accidents at all. How long had they been active? How far had they spread? Dr. Elizabeth Kane, the company's chief marine biologist, was waiting for us at the dock. She'd analyzed the preliminary samples from my suit, and her expression was grim as she helped me into the debriefing facility. "Marcus, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw down there. These organic samples, they're not from any known deep-sea species. The cellular structure is completely alien, like nothing in the fossil record." I gave her the full report, holding nothing back, despite the disbelief I saw growing in her eyes. The colony, the nursery, the transformed crew members, all of it spilled out in a torrent of desperate explanation. When I finished, Kane was quiet for a long time, studying the data on her tablet. "If what you're describing is accurate," she said finally, "we're dealing with a form of life that could revolutionize our understanding of evolution and intelligence. But it's also the most dangerous biological threat humanity has ever encountered." She pulled up a map of the North Sea oil platforms, dozens of installations scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. "We've had equipment failures on 12 other platforms in the past 3 years. 17 men lost on the Poseidon 7, but smaller numbers on the others. If your colony has been spreading..." The implications hit me like a physical blow. The colony wasn't confined to a single platform. They were establishing a network, using the oil rigs as stepping stones to colonize the entire North Sea, and from there, every ocean on Earth. "We have to warn the government," I said. "The military, the scientific community, everyone needs to know what's down there." Kane nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "The problem is evidence, Marcus. Your suit's cameras were damaged in the explosion. The platform is 200 feet underwater, and everything you've described sounds like the hallucinations of a diver suffering from nitrogen narcosis or decompression psychosis." She was right, and we both knew it. Without concrete proof, my story would be filed away as another case of deep-sea dementia, the psychological breakdown that occasionally affected divers working in extreme conditions. The colony's intelligence extended to protecting itself from discovery, and they'd covered their tracks well. But as we talked, I began to notice small details that chilled me more than the North Sea's embrace. Kane's eyes seemed to reflect light differently than they should have, and her skin had a waxy quality that reminded me of the transformed crew members. When she smiled, I caught a glimpse of what might have been too many teeth. "Of course, we'll need to verify your account," she said, her voice taking on the same distorted quality I'd heard from the Rodriguez thing in the platform. "Perhaps you could guide another team down to the site, show us exactly what you found?" I backed toward the door, my hand moving to the emergency beacon still clipped to my belt. "I think I need some rest first. The experience was traumatic." Kane's smile widened, and now I was certain those weren't human teeth behind her lips. "I understand completely, Marcus. Rest is important, but don't wait too long. The ocean doesn't like to keep its secrets." I ran. The beacon's electromagnetic pulse disrupted whatever control the colony had established over Kane, and she collapsed with a convulsive shudder as I burst through the facility's exit into the gray Aberdeen morning. Behind me, I could hear alarms beginning to sound as other staff members discovered her unconscious form. How many of them were compromised? How long had the colony been infiltrating the surface world through the diving crews and support personnel who worked the oil platforms? The scope of their patience and planning was staggering. They hadn't just been studying individual humans, they'd been mapping our entire civilization from the inside out. I drove my truck toward the Scottish Highlands, as far from the ocean as I could get, and began to plan my next move. The authorities wouldn't believe me without proof, but I knew where to find evidence that couldn't be dismissed. The other platforms Kane had mentioned, the ones that had suffered equipment failures in the past 3 years. Someone had to investigate them. Someone had to document what the colony was doing and find a way to stop their expansion before they completed their transformation of Earth's oceans into a vast nursery for their kind. As I drove through the heather-covered hills, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror and froze. My eyes looked normal, my skin had its usual weathered texture, but there was something else. A faint, translucent quality to my flesh that hadn't been there before my dive to the platform. I pulled over and examined myself more carefully, and that's when I found them. Tiny, almost invisible puncture wounds on my arms and legs where the colony's scouts had touched me during my escape. They weren't healing normally. Instead, they seemed to be spreading, the skin around them taking on that waxy, larval appearance I'd seen in the crew members. The colony hadn't just studied me during my time in the platform, they'd infected me. Rated babies possibly weeks before the transformation progressed far enough to compromise my consciousness. The countdown had begun, and this time it wasn't measured in oxygen remaining, but in how long I could stay human enough to complete my mission. The war between humanity and the colony had begun, and I was both its first casualty and its only hope for victory. In my truck's glove compartment, I had detailed maps of every oil platform in the North Sea and enough explosives to take out a small building. It was time to go back to the ocean. But this time, I was going prepared for a fight that would determine the future of both species. The depths were calling, and I intended to answer with fire and fury that would make the colony regret ever rising from their ancient darkness. The real horror wasn't what lived beneath the waves, it was what they planned to do with the world above them. And I was running out of time to stop them.
In the weeks that followed Marcus's final dive to the remaining platforms, maritime authorities reported a series of industrial accidents that destroyed 12 oil rigs across the North Sea. Official investigations blamed equipment failures and human error. But deep-sea fishermen still speak of strange lights beneath the waves and the sound of something vast and angry thrumming in the depths. Marcus Holloway was never found. His truck was discovered abandoned on the Aberdeen docks, filled with empty explosive containers and detailed maps of underwater installations. But sometimes, on nights when the North Sea runs dark and quiet, oil platform workers report seeing a lone figure in an antique diving suit moving through the deepest waters, still hunting something in the abyss. They say his eyes glow with bioluminescent fire, and his movements have the fluid grace of something that has learned to call the ocean home. The colony is contained, for now, but in the deepest trenches of Earth's oceans, new lights are beginning to flicker, and something vast and patient is dreaming of the surface world once again. The death calls to all of us, eventually. The only question is whether we'll answer as predator or prey.